We kicked off the program, did a 6-month, what we call discovery phase. So we engaged a whole range of people across the different markets. So we're dealing with a number of markets here: carbon, biodiversity, water, natural flood, nutrients, for example. So there's a whole range of stakeholders to engage and gather their inputs into the design of our standards program. So we did that. We put together a report last year outlining where our program was going to focus and the standards that we were going to create. We then developed the first of our standards, which is called the Overarching Principles for Nature Markets, and that was released in mid-March this year. It's been out for open consultation, which is just closed actually, and we're now looking at developing the second iteration, which will come out later in the year. So that Overarching Principle standard, that sets effectively what are the attributes of a high integrity nature market in the UK. It's focused on the UK markets. We look at some of the core principles that underpins that, what the minimum requirements that need to be followed, and we look across all the different services from nature, all the different types of land use, natural types of natural capital, and that kind of will set the framework and the principles and the framework that the rest of our standards will then follow and build upon.
You are listening to The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards, with Matthew Childs and Cindy Paragill.
When working in the nature markets, one of the things we found is that standards are sexy. Standards are the thing that everyone wants to talk about because of the importance of standards and what they're doing to support the scaling up of investment in these markets. Everyone wants to talk to me about standards. Everyone wants to talk to us, and everyone wants to be involved and talk about the benefits that our program can drive.
Playing us in at the top of the episode there was the voice of George Sethia from BSI, talking about the Nature Investment Standards Programme and the first standard to be produced through the programme, BSI Flex 701. And he was also talking about the fact that in this particular part of the economy, standards are considered sexy, which I think is a first for this podcast. Hello, this is Matthew Childs and welcome to The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards. And this episode is my conversation with George about the emerging area of nature markets, the Nature Investment Standards Programme being used to develop and support them in the UK, and about BSI Flex 701, a standard for the overarching principles of nature markets. Before we hear my conversation with George, a reminder that you can rate, review and subscribe to The Standard Show wherever you get your podcasts. And you can get in touch and find and follow us on social media too. All the details are in the show notes. George Sethia is Head of Consulting within Knowledge Solutions, the part of BSI that develops standards and standards programmes. He leads a team working on standards programmes enabling new markets to evolve and working with clients and stakeholders with the standards that are developed as a result. Now, it's worth saying that my conversation with George took place just before the recent UK general election, so many references made to government are about the previous Conservative administration. I spoke to George about the journey so far for the Nature Investment Standards Programme, the UK and international context in which it's being developed, and about that first standard developed under the programme, BSI Flex 701. And being the Standard Show, George also shared with me his own standards journey. I started by asking George about nature markets themselves. What are they and why do they matter?
So nature markets, these are around the trading of services from nature. So, for example, biodiversity is a service that's produced by nature, but nature produces a whole range of different things, other what we call ecosystem services. So carbon removals, for example, nature-based carbon removals is a service from nature. Natural flood mitigation, these are all services. The markets are based around the trading of these services. Like any market, you have a buy side and you need a buy side and a supply side. So on the buyer side, we have corporates who, for example, might be making voluntary purchases to offset some of their impacts. Think of a large corporate with trying to reduce their carbon emissions, and they need to purchase carbon credits. That's one buyer, but it could be any organization looking to offset a variety of impacts. Or it could be non-voluntary, so compliance drivers, compliance markets. So in the UK, in England, actually, we have regulation for biodiversity net gain. So if you're a housing developer and you are having an impact on habitats or needing to remove habitats, under law, you have to replace that habitat like for like, invest in a project that gives you biodiversity benefit and actually demonstrate a 10% uplift to that. So this is some of the drivers for on the buy side of who's looking to purchase some of these credits in these markets. There's also water companies. This is a newer emerging market. There's water companies that are looking to invest in natural flood mitigation or water quality improvements to prevent them having to have expensive and carbon intensive solutions in the same place. So we have an evolving demand side of the market, and to respond to this, we have the supply side of the market. So on the supplier side, we have major landowners, particularly farmers, who are developing projects that will generate the benefits that then need to be traded. So we have, an example could be a major landowner planting trees, creating woodlands, or looking at peatland restoration that captures a lot of carbon and removes a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. Or you've got farmers changing their practices, moving to more sustainable practices, for example, that reduces pollution into rivers. Again, that provides the water quality benefits that the water companies are interested in buying. And that's the market as it exists and as it is emerging at the moment. In terms of your second question, I mean, why is this important? I mean, nature is absolutely key at the moment, both on the journey to net zero. So the potential impact this can have in terms of removing carbon from the atmosphere, trees, soils, regenerating soils, how much carbon those could capture, peatland restoration. These are all hugely important pieces of the puzzle, if you like, on the journey to net zero, but also towards a nature positive society. So more and more we're now talking about the nature and biodiversity impacts that companies are having and the society we want. And we get nature right, we get these solutions right, and we get more investment into these markets, we can have a massive impact on net zero and a nature positive society.
I'm keen to know also, George, about the sort of UK policy perspective here. I mean, you talked there about sort of nature markets, and you can understand how this might be considered a global issue, but is this an issue being driven here by the UK government, and how is BSI involved?
Yeah, it is, and it's really being driven by the UK government front and foremost, actually. I mean, nature's being looked at a lot of places in the world, but together as a single market, the UK is really leading in this area. So the UK has put this as one of their key priorities. They outlined last year in their green finance strategy that they want to set a target, they have set a target of driving 1 billion per year of private finance into nature by 2030. And DEFRA released a nature market framework last year, which outlined some of the key steps and challenges and solutions that are required to deliver this increased investment. That included standards at the core of it. So that's how government have come to us, and we've engaged with them around the role of standards and supporting the scale up of these markets. It's a massive priority for government at the moment.
I want to dig into that there. You've mentioned standards. You know, what's overall, what's the role of standards in this area, and why do we need them?
First of all, actually, we've been delivering this program for the past year, and a lot of people have been looking to us and our standards program as kind of the answer to these markets. And I think there's a lot of, as DEFRA have put out in their nature market framework, there's a lot of things that need to be looked at. But I think one thing that everyone agrees, from everyone we've spoken to, and we've spoken to a lot of people and engaged a lot of people in our program, that standards are absolutely key to these markets growing. To expand on that, I mean, the reason is that if you think about the services that I've described, the carbon removals from the atmosphere or the biodiversity uplift, these are quite intangible services. They're not things that you can generally experience. They're not things, it's very difficult for a buyer of these services to come in and check how much or experience how much carbon they've actually removed from the atmosphere. So what they need when they're purchasing that credit is they need to have trust and assurance that credit represents, a carbon credit represents 1 ton of carbon being removed from the atmosphere, for example. They need to have confidence in that. And standards, that's why standards come in. Standards play that role. They set the criteria for what the credit needs to demonstrate, or what a good credit needs to demonstrate. So making sure that the service, the amount of carbon that underpins that's been represented by that credit, has been properly quantified, has been used using the latest science, has been properly verified. It's it's a true and genuine and additional intervention that's happened to remove that carbon or biodiversity uplift. And it's a permanent thing. So it's not going to just be reversed in a few years' time. It needs to be a permanent outcome. If you don't have that, if you don't have that assurance, you can't, there's no guarantee, you can't tell whether you're actually getting what you're paying for. So standards are really, really important to set those rules and set those requirements for what those credits need to meet. And then that's why it's the robustness of those standards are particularly important as well. If you're setting the requirements too low, then you're not necessarily getting assurance that what you're buying is of sufficient quality. So it's really interesting at the moment. We've seen in the global carbon markets over the past few years that this trust, these credits and the trust in what these credits represent is completely really broken down. There is a limited amount of confidence now, and major corporates are saying, we are not willing to take the risk, the PR risk of purchasing credits through these markets anymore, because we don't want to be called greenwashers. We don't want to be funding something that's not real and not genuine. The carbon markets are seeing this now. There's a massive integrity issue. I always, when I talk about this, I always talk about high integrity. This is the core to this program, what we're doing. These markets need integrity. If they're going to scale, if you're going to drive more investment, buyers are now demanding that integrity is there, that these credits represent real, genuine outcomes. There is high quality standards that underpin those to make sure that they have the right assurances. And that's it. I mean, that's the point of our program. That is what our standards programs are trying to do. They're setting the benchmark for what good looks like, what high quality and what high integrity is in these markets.
Standards affect all of us every day, wherever we go, whatever we do. By defining good practice, they help people and organizations to do things better. Each year, standards bodies publish thousands of standards, and we are looking for more people like you to join our community of standards makers. We welcome applicants from all fields, backgrounds, and career stages. Our goal is a simple one: to have a balance of views around the table. By becoming a standards maker, you could help to improve the way things are made and done, like creating healthier and more inclusive workplaces, developing higher quality healthcare systems, making advances in AI governance, or accelerating climate action, and many, many others. So, if you want to make a difference and shape the world through standards, start your standards making journey now. Details of how to do so are in the show notes.
Now, you mentioned, George, we're a year in to the programme. What's the current state of play here? What standards have been or are being developed at the moment?
Yeah, so we kicked off the programme, did a 6-month what we call discovery phase. So we engaged a whole range of people across the different markets. So we're dealing with a number of markets here: carbon, biodiversity, water, natural flood, nutrients, for example. So there's a whole range of stakeholders to engage and gather their inputs into the design of our standards program. So we did that. We put together a report last year outlining where our program was going to focus and the standards that we were going to create. Had a lot of feedback on that. And then we developed the first of our standards, which is called the Overarching Principles for Nature Markets. And that was released, the first iteration of that was released in mid-March this year. It's been out for open consultation, which is just closed actually. And we're now looking at developing the second iteration, which will come out later in the year. So that overarching principle standard, that sets effectively what are the attributes of a high integrity nature market in the UK. It's focused on the UK markets. We look at some of the core principles that underpins that, what the minimum requirements that need to be followed. And we look across all the different services from nature, all the different types of land use, natural types of natural capital. And that kind of will set the framework and the principles and the framework that the rest of our standards will then follow and build upon. So that this standard is BSI Flex 701.
And George, just in terms of, you mentioned there about sort of people involved in developing this, just give a sense of the sorts of organisations that are involved in developing this standard. This is BSI Flex 701. So who's involved in that?
So we've ensured that there's a cross representation from across all the markets. So we've had the suppliers side, for example, represented from farmers and landowners. We've had representatives from the buyer side. So we've had some corporates and investors involved in our standards group. We've had regulators involved. We've had NGOs, academics, and policy setters as well. So we've had, and then of course the what they call codes and standards themselves, people who are actually setting individual specific requirements within these markets that will work to the new standards that we put in place. So we've had a whole range of people with different angles, different perspectives involved in the development of this Flex 701.
Now, why a BSI Flex for this particular area? Why is this approach more appropriate maybe than a British standard or a PAS even? You know, why a Flex for this area of standards work?
It's really because of where we are in the state of the market development. So we're in the very early stages, particularly in some of these newer areas. I mentioned water quality, natural floods, even biodiversity credit markets. These are pretty nascent. These have only developed over the past few years. And our standards are actually driving the market development as much as anything. So we're learning from practical outcomes and projects as they develop. And we're kind of leading the way in terms of what needs to be, what does good look like, but we're also building in evidence and practical experience. So it's really important that our standards flex. It's really important that they need to adapt and evolve along with the markets. And that's why we went for the BSI Flex model. That doesn't mean in the future that might change. We might start to firm up as we get to a state that we're all comfortable with, and we need a bit more certainty. We might move on to a different model, but at the moment, Flex is the clear route forward.
You've talked there, George, about the sort of this standard setting the overall framework. What's next for the standards program here? Where do we go next?
So after these principles, which are currently being under public consultation and being released, we are then looking to develop further standards that will build upon the principles, but in the context of some of the specific markets that we're looking at. So we're currently drafting standards for nature-based carbon and biodiversity markets. These will build on some of those principles and build out some of the specific, more granular requirements that need to be delivered within those markets. But we're also looking at other standards that have been identified from our initial engagement that are really critical to supporting the scale up of these markets. So, for example, we've had a lot of feedback that there needs to be a high quality communities standard of how projects should engage and work with and share benefits with the local communities where they're operating. So we've taken that feedback. We're working with lots of private sector led initiatives in the market, and we are proposing to develop a new BSI community standard that will be applicable for the UK. And then the other big area that our program's going to focus on is the assurance side of it. So one of the things we noted is that standards are absolutely key. High quality standards are needed in these markets, but they alone are not going to solve the issue of integrity and trust that I mentioned earlier. What the buyers need is the confidence that when they're purchasing those credits, they can see that those credits are certified as offering high integrity against a set of standards. So we have now agreed that we will be looking at what those assurance mechanisms should be, how those will work with our standards, how we give a view to the markets of what they need to do to align and get certified against the standards going forward.
So, George, given this, there's a lot of work going on here, obviously from a UK perspective, but obviously nature markets are a global issue. I just wonder how your work and how the work of BSI is connecting to the global work in this area.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, actually, because we've identified the need to connect up with lots of work that's going on internationally and not duplicate and take in learnings from global markets into what we're doing. So one of the initiatives we're really close to at the moment is ICVCM in the global. That's the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, who are setting the core carbon principles for global carbon markets. So we are working closely with them to align our principles and carbon standards with what's being set globally. And we will be looking at, when we come to assurance frameworks, we'll be looking at that as well. But there's a lot of stuff that's going on in emerging biodiversity credit markets as well. TNFD, which is the task force for natural financial disclosures, have released their guidance. We are again linking up with those initiatives, making sure that people who are involved or driving those initiatives are involved in our program, and we're cross-referencing and linking up as much as possible. So yeah, really, really important point.
Now, here on The Standards Show, we love our standards journeys, of the standards themselves, of standards programs. But of course, we particularly love and celebrate the personal standards journeys of the people involved. And we couldn't let George go without him sharing his.
I joined BSI 5 years ago almost, from a consultancy firm before. I knew very, very little, almost nothing about standards. Probably knew what ISO 9001 and 14001 was, and that's about it. I joined BSI because, but really because of, well, we're a non-profit company. I like what we're doing in terms of purpose, and I really like the focus on these cross-sectoral major macro-related issues and the challenges we're trying to solve. It's not just one organization that's looking at them. It's multiple organizations. It's an entire industry. So really that's what attracted me to it. Obviously, I've then been learning. I have a steep learning curve in terms of what the role of standards and the benefits they can provide. It's been an interesting journey over the past 5 years. When I joined, the consulting part of the knowledge division was in its infancy. We were very much looking around how we build that capability, what we could offer. A lot of back and forth. Actually, there was a lot of areas we could play, and a lot of demand for the consultancy services that we were starting to build. But what we've done recently is finally found a niche, if you like, around enabling some of these new markets, early stage new markets, to develop in really, really interesting areas. So obviously I've talked about the Nature investment program today, but we're doing work now on decarbonisation of transport, for example. We're doing work to support the rollout of new technologies, connected autonomous vehicles, future of flight technologies, etc. These are really, really, new and early stage markets, but really important to meet some of our policy goals. And our consulting offer blends really well with our traditional standards capability to provide real advice to governments on what they should be doing, where they should be intervening, and where we can have the most impact. So where we've got to now is a really, really interesting place. And I think we're starting to. Going back to the reason I joined, which was addressing some of the most pressing challenges and having a real impact across industries, we're starting to really say we're doing that now, and the impact is clear in what we're offering. So no, it's been a great journey. Really happy about where we are, and there's lots more to come.
So George, would it be fair to say that over the past 5 years you've been seduced by standards?
When working in the nature markets, one of the things we found is that standards are sexy. Standards are the thing that everyone wants to talk about, which is quite different to some of the other market or the other projects that we do. And as I mentioned, because of the importance of standards and what they're doing to support the scaling up of investment in these markets, everyone wants to talk to me about standards. Everyone wants to talk to us, and everyone wants to be involved and talk about the benefits that our program can drive.
Our thanks to George Sethia for speaking to us about the Nature Investment Standards Programme and for sharing his standards journey. Now, if you want to discover more about nature markets, the Nature Investment Standards Programme, BSI Flex 701, and about how to get involved in standards, then check out the links in the show notes. And a reminder that the show notes are also where you can find details of our socials and all of the other ways to get in touch with us here on The Standard Show.
You have been listening to an episode of The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards, with Matthew Childs and Cindy Paragill.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.